Nate, we are back, and we are looking at some keep, trade, cut scenarios. We both brought 6 players-ish to the forefront here that we are kind of on the fringe of maybe cutting off a roster, maybe trying to get off a roster, players we consider to be roster cloggers. And it's a really big time of year to be focusing on this because of your rookie drafts. You're adding a bunch of players. Sometimes you need to make room for new players, those new rookies. And, hey, sometimes there's players that don't even get drafted. Maybe you have a 3-round draft. Maybe you have a 4-round draft. There might be players sneaking through the draft that, or you're in an IDP league, and there's some players that you really want to roster and, stash. You got to make some room for those guys, unfortunately, one way or another. And real quick, just to get into some disclaimers, I know you kind of have some too when we get into these, but some for me, some of these players have upside and 100% are worth rostering. But at the end of the day, that doesn't mean you have to be the person rostering that player, because I want to strive with my rosters to have better players where these are just not even discussions I'm having where it's like, oh man, do I really want X player that we're going to talk about today? And while we might agree to cut some of these players, I'll never suggest to make a cut you don't have to make. If you're not trying to make room for a rookie pick or try to go pick somebody else up off waivers at any time, don't make cuts to make cuts. Anybody can do anything at any time and be worth that much more next week after a breakout week. And of course, if you want to avoid getting some roster cloggers on your roster for the future, check out the draft guide if you haven't already. Details to do that in the pinned comment below, as well as the YouTube description. But Nate, without further ado, your first pick here, your most rostered keep, trade, cut scenario you got for us. What do you got?
Yeah, I got Rico Dowdle here, the current RB2 for the Dallas Cowboys. And I want to start off with him because we're talking about a lot of players today that we are going to cut, or the question is, do we cut this guy? And Rico Dowdle is the second most rostered player that we're talking about in today's episode. And he is one of the main people that we're looking at our rosters and saying, do I cut Rico? I mean, like the Dallas Cowboys, they got Zeke now, but I mean, do I keep Rico? Do I not keep Rico? That's a big question right now. You got Deuce Vaughn there. You got Royce Freeman, who was just signed. I'm saying you keep Rico Dowdle, Bob. I've always been a fan of Rico Dowdle going back to the South Carolina days. And look, he hasn't done much in his time. He's been in the league, in and out for the practice squad for the Dallas Cowboys for the last 4 years. So they know him pretty well. And they've elected to keep him around. And they were happy enough with Rico and the incoming Zeke to not draft a running back in this year's draft, famously to not draft a running back in this year's draft. And Rico Dowdle had a career year last year, Bob, if you didn't know. He had 91 attempts for 372 yards and 2 touchdowns, okay? But even better than that, he had 19 receptions for 158 yards. And, he showed some receiving prowess. Zeke's going to be out there, and I think Zeke's going to get the majority of the workload. Zeke's probably going to score like 15 touchdowns or something ridiculous, end up as a RB1 on the season, and everyone's going to be pissed about it. So go buy him for a third if you still can. But Rico Dowdle, Zeke's old. I don't believe in the little small guy, Deuce Vaughn. I think Rico Dowdle, this is his last shot to be relevant in a season. I don't think he's probably going to have much going for him after this. But this is his last shot. I think he's going to take it where Rico's probably going to be a little backup where, you're not going to be starting him on a week-to-week basis. There's no way. But if Zeke goes down, Rico's not going to have the full backfield, but I think he's going to do enough where he could be a spot starter at times. You might be able to flip him for a third. You can't do that. Well, you might be able to do that now, actually. I would also be okay. We're talking about cutting guys, not cutting guys. I don't want to cut Rico, but I'm also okay with trading him. As much as I love Rico, I would move him for a third now. I'll move him for a third in the season. I'm a Rico fan, but I'm also logical. He's not going to be the RB1 of the future for the Dallas Cowboys or anything. So if you can move him for a third right now, I would do it. You might have to wait until the season, but I think either way, you can probably move him for a third at some point. So don't cut him.
I was going to say, I wanted to test your resolve because I know you say keep, and that's your primary go-to, but being open to trading, you touched on that, and I'm pulling up some trades from Fantasy Calc's trade database, and as of today, these trades have gone down. Rico Dowdle for a 24 fourth, Rico Dowdle for a 24 third, Rico Dowdle for Khalil Shakir.
Oh, see, I would do that, and see, Bob, not only would I absolutely trade him for a guy like Khalil Shakir, who I think is in a great position right now, but if you're trading him for a third-round pick this year, especially if you can make it like an early third, maybe you add a fourth or fifth one there to make it an early third. Sure. Bob, our boy Marshawn Lloyd is dropping to the early third in these rookie drafts. If you can move on from Rico and get Marshawn Lloyd, that's how you do Dynasty, man.
Yeah, I think with a lot of these, and I know a lot of mine, a suggestion of mine, and how you move on from some of these less sexy players is by using the draft to just pivot up a couple picks. Sometimes you can move a handful of picks depending on the player. It always depends on how much value is this guy really worth. Rico Dowdle is rostered in 81% of leagues. People like Rico enough to roster him that much, and maybe it's the same person in every single league that's driving up his rostership. It's Nate in all his leagues and all of his cohorts, but I think that alone kind of suggests, hey, there's probably a decent enough value where I could move him up, or interest, I should say, that you can move up a handful of picks, and like you said, maybe turn your early fourth into a mid third, who knows, or maybe your mid third into a late second, who knows. I'm just saying, knock on some doors, give it a shot. Because at the end of the day, we really don't want to cut any of these guys outright unless we really, really have to. And a player that I'm just pretty much ready to move on from in some way, form, or fashion, Darnell Mooney, 89% rostered, not taxi eligible. That is another thing to consider. If they are taking up viable bench space that you could be using for actual starters, another thing to consider that, hey, this guy is a 100% a roster caller. Because if you have the taxi available to you still, there's always that, well, I could just put him on the taxi. He's not really hurting anybody there. I'm just kind of waiting and seeing, as much as I'd also argue that that is still a waste of roster space, but it is what it is. So with Darnell Mooney, what are we really expecting from Darnell Mooney at this point? Yes, he's had one good season, and since his injury, he's really been downhill, and it's taken some time to get him to work back. He's in this new Atlanta offense that we want to be excited about, but at the end of the day, you're looking at what I expect to be the fourth best receiving option in this offense, competing with Rondale Moore for that prestigious role of being the fourth receiver, and who is also another cut candidate, Rondale Moore, that is, in my opinion, behind guys like Drake London, Kyle Pitts, and Bijan Robinson, who was the third target getter in this offense last year. I know this offense didn't really have a lot going on for weapons. I don't think Darnell Mooney is the piece that changes that at this point. So I think there's a good chance on top of all this that Darnell Mooney gets locked into more of a deep role. He's succeeded in that. That's been about a quarter of his targets every single one of his seasons so far. And if there's anything we know, Nate, it's that deep threats are not real viable for fantasy points, especially when they're not targeted super often. So he's going to be a low target getter down the field, not super efficient targets wise. I'm good. And, we get into the roster percentage that we talked about with Rico Dowdle, 89%. With his high roster percentage, there's clearly still an interest in what Mooney can or can't do for you fantasy-wise. And looking at Fantasy Calc trade database, there's a boatload of trades today moving Darnell Mooney for a third or fourth round picks, which I'll gladly do at this point. Give me the reroll. I like enough in the third round. I can find something to work in the fourth round or use one of those fourth round picks to move up like we discussed before. Yeah. Or if I can't get a pick straight up, I'll use and move up a few picks later elsewhere in drafts like I just discussed. But it's a tough guy to cut, but again, at the end of the day, like, what are you really expecting with him? Find a way to get him off your roster. There's enough interest somewhere that will want the upside of Darnell Mooney. See you later. I want him off my roster. I have a tough time cutting him because I know there's interest.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, if it's between him and, there were some leagues that some players that I'll be discussing today where I drafted so many players and I was foolish and didn't make enough roster space for myself to be able to keep who I wanted. I wasn't good enough about trading up or, diversifying my profile, the next year picks, whatever the case is. Darnell Mooney wouldn't make it on those rosters. I know that much. And much as I get that he's rostered elsewhere, again, that concept of he doesn't need to be on my roster or yours. So that's my take on Darnell Mooney. Feel free to add in, Nate.
I got a good amount of Darnell Mooney across my rosters, I will say. And while I'm not expecting a lot, I still am interested enough after the Falcons did not draft another wide receiver. I thought they were going to add somebody and make, Darnell goes into the wide receiver 3 role, which at best is like the 5th target on the team. And at that point, I would be pretty okay with cutting or, trading for a 4th or something like that. But he's the wide receiver 2 there, I think, over Rondale Moore. So, there's still enough intrigue, especially because my mind makes this very illogical connection to Darnell Mooney being Jordan Addison for Kirk Cousins. So
love it.
which
Yeah.
I guess makes Drake London Justin Jefferson. So take that as
there you go. You heard it here first. Drake London is Justin Jefferson from Nate. But hey, and that's the exact thought process I'm looking for when I'm looking to deal Darnell Mooney, because I personally have very low expectations. I don't expect him to be, getting, I think 50 targets at this point, probably pretty generous for a guy in this position. Maybe you're at that point, but fantasy wise, anywhere near that mark is not going to be a lot for you. So I'm good moving on.
The Falcons offense is just so unknown to me at the moment. I don't know. Are they going to be a high passing offense? Just because Kirk is there doesn't mean it's going to be a high passing offense. That's just a Vikings thing, not necessarily a Kirk thing. So, I don't know what this offense is going to look like. I don't think there's going to be a ton of upside with Darnell. If you can move him for a third, I'm pretty okay with that, especially like an early third. I'd be totally fine with that. Re-rolling. There's a couple guys in the early third I like. So good with that move. My next guy, I was so surprised to see that this guy is rostered in 76% of sleeper leagues, Bob.
Yeah.
That is absolutely ridiculous. What are you doing if you still have Cam Akers on your roster, other than just literally clogging up your roster? This guy is DED dead for Dynasty, okay? Current free agent, has 2 Achilles tears, and before he had his second Achilles tear in week 10, well, he had 1 game for the Rams where he ran 22 times for 29 yards. It's not great, Bob. And then over the next 6 games that he played for the Vikings after he got traded, he averaged 3.6 yards per attempt, had 138 yards. Cam Akers coming off 2 Achilles tears. I know he's athletic. He's the guy that started the conversation, the started the phrase of he's an athlete playing running back. So he's athletic, but that matters for 1 Achilles tear to come back from, not 2. Two's like, I love J.K. Dobbins, but after an Achilles tear and a torn ACL, like, what kind of expectations do I have? And J.K. Dobbins was a much better runner than Cam Akers. Cam Akers doesn't even have a home at this moment. I think there's no hope for Cam Akers at this point. I have no faith in him making a comeback from this, though. Cam Akers is not going to be relevant for fantasy anytime soon. I don't think he'll be relevant again. So 76% of you need to cut Cam Akers. Get him off your roster. Yeah. You're going to cut him anyway after you draft your rookie draft. So just go ahead and move him on from now. I don't think he even has any trade value. Get rid of Cam Akers.
Yeah, not until he's on a roster and there's some,
and there's no reason to hold him that long.
Yeah. That the only justification for having him on a roster to me is you're a rebuilding team with just nothing going on, and you're hoping, and you have all the space in the world. Like you're grasping at straws with the players that you're trying to get on your roster, and you're hoping that he signs somewhere, gets some flash of hype that you're able to deal on.
You can't tell me that someone on your waivers is better than Cam Akers.
That I tend to agree. But you never know in some of these deeper leagues. But yeah, Cam Akers is definitely a cut for me. This is somebody, you touch on it with the athleticism, when that is what so much of your skill is based off of. And then you have 2 of your wheels broke off. Either way, when you lose that bit of athleticism, and that's what you have to work with, and you don't have the elite vision, you don't have the elite prowess as just a pure ball carrier, what are you left with? Moving on to another running back. I got a lot of running backs today, and that's okay. I think there's plenty of discussions to be had, but Izzy Abanikanda, another player who I felt last year was more of that athlete playing running back, and I might have even comped him to Cam Akers. I don't remember if that was my direct comp for him. I know he was a discussion for me, but I felt he was very much athletic, not as much a pristine ball carrier of any kind. So, as you might remember, Nate, Izzy A was everybody's favorite sleeper darling, rookie-wise, last offseason, before the draft, especially before he was drafted in New York. And as we kind of probably could have expected, was not utilized, might have been utilized less than we expected in this Jets offense, and wasn't even utilized on special teams. He was a great special teams returner in college, so I kind of expected him to garner a role there. But total over the season, Izzy Abanikanda had 22 total carries, 7 receptions on 10 targets, which is actually pretty wild considering his total utilization. That's actually pretty focused on for how little he was actually on the field. So when he was on the field, he was basically getting a target, and 5 total kick returns. So if you're lucky at this point, with the additions of Braylon Allen, with the addition of Isaiah Davis as well, if you're lucky, he snags some receiving work on the plays that Breece Hall takes off to get a breather. But I don't think there's much fantasy relevance to be had here. I wouldn't even consider him a handcuff in this backfield. I think that's Braylon Allen's role, and maybe him and Isaiah Davis battle it out, whatever the case is. But given the lack of usage last year, plus these new additions, I think Izzy Abanikanda is pretty cooked. If you can trade him, it's probably for a late rookie pick, which I'll absolutely take, or fab if you can get that in there. I'll take the reroll. But if you need the space, this is a guy 100%. I'm happy cutting at this point. I just don't think you're getting much for him. We always want to try to shop what we can, throw him in on some deal. Maybe somebody's higher on him than I am, but I have very low expectations for Izzy Abanikanda going forward. So
I agree. They traded Michael Carter away, and they said it was to give Izzy some more opportunities. He didn't really do much with those opportunities, and they drafted 2 running backs. So I think they've made their decision at this point. My next running back I'm going to talk about here is Samaje Perine for the Denver Broncos. He is rostered in 58% of leagues, Bob. He is not eligible for taxi. And the Broncos, who just drafted Aldrick Estime in the 5th round and picked up my favorite UDFA running back, Blake Watson, they can cut Samaje Perine and save $3 million in cap space if they do. And then that would make their running back room look like Javonte Williams, Aldrick Estime, and Jaleel McLaughlin, who looked pretty good last year at times, catching the ball in the backfield. If it's a battle maybe between Samaje Perine and Jaleel McLaughlin for that RB3, RB4 spot, last spot on the roster, with Blake Watson in there too for that battle. I don't know if they're going to keep 3 or 4, but it's usually one of the 2. So if it's 3, it's between the 3 of them for that last spot. It makes a lot more sense for them to move on from Perine at this point, take on, McLaughlin or Watson, and, one of those guys on the rookie contract still. Don't need to pay Samaje Perine $4.5 million to be an RB3. So, I just think the writing's kind of on the wall here for Samaje Perine. At this time of the year, we have to start taking a look into August, and there's going to be cut downs, and every single year there's veterans that are cut that we don't always necessarily expect, or veterans that we do know are on the bubble that get cut for the new guys, especially on a team like the Broncos, where, let's be honest, they're not playoff contenders this year. They're a team that's in a rebuild. They need young talent, and they need to look at their young talent, see what they have, evaluate it, and see if there's some upside there. They know what they have in Samaje Perine, and he's not going to be a starter for them. They need to see what they got with Jaleel McLaughlin, with Aldrick Estime, with Blake Watson, and with Javonte Williams to see if they want to re-sign him after this year. He's on his last year of his rookie deal. So, I think in the pecking order, the way things work out cap-wise, Samaje Perine, he's probably on his way out of the Denver Broncos roster. So go ahead and move him now, cut him now, get ahead of the game.
Yeah, and looking at trades for him, it's pretty desolate wasteland of looking at trades for Samaje Perine. A lot of the trade-up stuff that we talked about already, moving a round 5 pick plus Samaje for another round 5 pick. Yeah. So you're not doing much with him. So probably he's likely a cut, probably a cut, which I think is okay. I think you're not leaving too much on the table with him. Yeah. So I don't hate it at all. And my next pick is actually somebody you just mentioned. I'm looking at Jaleel McLaughlin here, and 81% rostership, and looking at what McLaughlin has done. 3 halfway decent weeks, and Jaleel McLaughlin is rostered in 81% of leagues.
Wow.
Is this what the running back landscape has come to, is my note here. And I do think that, for what it's worth, I think there are still some teams catching up to getting into the drafts, coming back to their leagues after some time away, that there's probably going to be some shifts over time in how rostered some players are. I think McLaughlin is one that probably falls down, I would hope.
Yeah.
Because you look at this offense, you're going to have a healthy Javonte Williams, who we know can catch the ball. You have a freshly minted Aldrick Estime, who I don't think is a huge ball catcher, but did show off that he could do it in college. But I think this ends up being kind of a 1-2 beast, with Javonte getting a bulk of the work plus receiving, and Aldrick Estime gets that spell work between the tackles and things of that sort to take that beating. And maybe if McLaughlin stays around on the roster, like you said, they brought in Blake Watson, who is a very interesting, I think he could easily be Jaleel McLaughlin plus also UDFA. No huge ties to him. 100% agree that Samaje Perine is probably the odd man out here, just cash-wise. It just makes sense to not pay him that much money. Maybe you see Jaleel McLaughlin take up some receiving work here, but this is a player that, if he does well for fantasy at all, you're probably never going to know when to start him. And at that point, it's like, what am I doing with him on my roster? I think he ends up being a cut. I don't think he has a lot of trade value to him either, despite having this 81% rostership. But I think a lot of that is going to catch up to us over time, especially with the Estime ad and people getting back in their leagues. I think people are going to be pretty quick to cut him once drafts come through. I think he's going to be on the pretty far end of people's roster, pretty high cut candidate for most people. So I don't think that's too hard of a take.
He's one of those players that's still kind of left on the teams that were competitive and had Jaleel
Right.
McLaughlin, in case they needed them,
Yeah.
and they just haven't made those cuts yet. And one reason I keep bringing up Blake Watson is because the Broncos made a pretty big bet on Blake Watson. They guaranteed him $250,000, Bob. There's a lot of money for an undrafted free agent, especially at a position like the running back position. So I think they liked him a lot. With a guarantee like that, if they had an extra 7th round, they probably would have picked him up. Probably be about the same salary, honestly. $250,000 reasons to keep Blake Watson on the roster at the end of the offseason. So
sure.
Next guy for me, Bob, is a tight end. I believe it might be our only tight end of this episode.
You are correct. Correct.
And it's a tight end that I'm actually pretty excited about. Daniel Bellinger.
Interesting.
Yeah, Daniel Bellinger. I've been a Danny Belly fan for a while. That's what we're going to call him, Danny Belly. Me and Mike. His rookie year, he averaged 6.8 fantasy points. I know that's nothing crazy, but for a rookie tight end who was day 3 tight end to be pushed into the starting slot when Darren Waller went down with injury his rookie year and put up some decent weeks, had a couple touchdowns, was considering the Giants offense, a decent little play out of the tight end position. And he's been on the roster, and when he's been called upon, he's always done well. Not incredible, not great, but well. And Theo Johnson was drafted there in day 3. And I like Theo. He's got the great athleticism. He's definitely more athletic than Danny Belly. But Theo Johnson, we got to remember tight ends. They take a while to develop, especially, I think Theo's got the athleticism, but maybe not quite developed to be an NFL tight end yet. So I foresee for this season, if Darren Waller does retire, Daniel Bellinger is probably the starting tight end there to start the season. And I think Theo, maybe by the end of the season, certainly by next season, should have the reins on the starting role. But that at least gives you a season to see what you have with Daniel Bellinger. And I think he's produced enough at this point as a backup tight end, drafted day 3, that he's worth keeping on your roster. If you already have 2-3 tight ends on your roster, you probably don't need Daniel Bellinger on your roster. But if you're thin at the tight end position and you just need someone to have a dart throw on, to have some upside for some possible production this season, I think Daniel Bellinger is actually a pretty decent pick. Currently rostered in 57% of leagues. Unfortunately, no longer eligible for taxi. This is his 3rd year coming up. But I am a Daniel Bellinger fan, Bob. So I'm keeping him. I don't think you need to cut Daniel Bellinger if you have him. Now, probably next offseason, if he doesn't do much this year, go ahead and move on from him.
Yeah, I think if he does produce for you at all, I think he's a pretty big sell candidate for me. Because I don't think you're selling him for much now. Tight ends always are pretty. You're not getting much unless it's a top guy really at all. So I mean, even some of the other guys we've discussed today, where we're getting 4th and 5ths, like Daniel Bellinger, good luck getting that for him at this point. But
once Darren Waller retires, and then the season starts, and you see that Daniel Bellinger is the starting tight end for the Giants, you might be able to move him for a 3rd, 4th round pick.
Yeah, that's possible for sure. And the reason I'm hesitant to buy in on the long-term picture. So I do these things. If you've been following along, I've been putting together a lot of these production grading over through the Discord, talking through college prospects and things of that sort. And to me, Daniel Bellinger profiles much more as the prototypical blocking tight end on an offense who just kind of lucked into work because he was the last guy there. And you look at Theo Johnson's pure production, 41st percentile out of 152 tight ends, which isn't great by any stretch of the imagination. But then you look at Daniel Bellinger, pure production, raw production, 24th percentile. So these are just the numbers that equal fantasy points, what these guys are doing, stacked up to all the other tight ends in college that have come out over the last several years. So that leads me to believe that at the end of the day, also Theo Johnson going to a better, blue blood program at the end of the day. Tight ends don't produce a ton, so it's kind of, a little bit of a wash, I guess you could say. But blue blood program, I think Theo Johnson over time takes this role. I think Danny Bellinger, Danny Belly can for sure probably take the role because, like you said, tight ends take time. I just would not be putting my chips on Bellinger long term. I'm fine with a keep for now, but I do think he's a trade candidate for me at some point, if not a cut now, because I'm fine with not cutting him now because you're not, not getting anything for him when he has opportunity in front of him. That's something I'm not super cool with when it comes to these cuts. But
tight end 25 in 2022 on a points per game basis. Not bad for a rookie.
Man, when you hit me with stats like that,
Almost
I
a
don't know what
tight
to
end too, man.
Oh man, on a per game basis, that's pretty wild. All right. Speaking of guys who have done okay on a per game basis over short spans of time, another running back, shocker, Donta Foreman, 69th percentile rostership. Nice. Not taxi eligible, obviously, but Foreman is another player who just keeps finding space on rosters in the NFL as well as fantasy rosters. But honestly, why? He's had some runs of relevance for sure. I know there was times when he was with the Bears that he's a league winner because he's the running back one, and this running back room is actually good for now. And then very quickly fell flat on his face for the remainder of the season. As I mentioned, has some runs of relevance, but he's never finished higher than running back 38 on the year, and he only has one season logging more than 9 games. And now there's an Achilles tear in there for sure, I believe in his rookie year, and took a lot of time to come back from that. But now he finds himself buried on the Cleveland depth chart, which, if I'm being honest, is just kind of where it feels like every player goes to have their value die. If I'm not mistaken, I could be wrong, and ultimately clogging up your fantasy roster. And I think that's what he's doing here. Looking at trades that have been made today, Fantasy Calc's trade database going for thirds and fourth round picks, and a third or fourth round picks. I should clarify, not both. That'd be pretty cool though. But third or fourth round picks, and anything more than a fifth for Foreman, who is a backup to Nick Chubb. Jerome Ford has been better than Donta Foreman.
Yep.
So he's probably a third string, maybe if he makes the roster. And I don't think you realistically get those in a lot of leagues, but hey, it's happening in some. So you have to kind of take the time to consider, hey, this might be an option for you. But I think at the end of the day, this is most likely you're sending Donta Foreman to the Chubb manager as insurance in a small trade up. You're more likely cutting him or adding him as a last minute throw in to an already existing deal. Just something to, build up that deal and be like, hey, you have Nick Chubb. Here's this guy to just that little gross cherry on top of value to add on at the end of the day. But most likely a cut for me, I think. And I think I'm fine with that. With what he's done, I'm more than happy moving on for Donta Foreman.
I'm fine with that as well. My next player here, Bob, another player that I have rostered on a lot of my teams, Jalen Tolbert, wide receiver for the Cowboys, currently rostered in 44% of sleeper leagues. He's coming off your taxi, though. He's been in the league for 2 years, and in that time, he has caught 24 passes for 280 yards. And he's coming off your taxi, and you're wondering, Nate, 2 years ago, you were all about Jalen Tolbert, and you told me to draft him. So what do I do now that he's coming off my taxi squad and has done just about nothing? Well, Tolbert coming off a career year last year where he caught 22 balls for 268 yards, the majority of his career stats at this point. I'm going to tell you to cut him. As much as I love Jalen Tolbert and the fact that he is the wide receiver 3, he is the wide receiver 3 on the Cowboys, but he was the wide receiver 3 on the Cowboys last year, basically. Michael Gallup came off the injury and really wasn't out there too much. Tolbert ran 300 routes last year. He caught 22 balls. He had 1.4 yak rec. I mean, his yards per route run was under 1. The efficiency stats weren't there because he actually got volume last year and didn't do anything with it. Last year was the year for us to see if Jalen Tolbert could take that next step, and he didn't. So this is kind of that fool's gold where, he's a top 3 wide receiver on a team that has a good quarterback, but Brandon Cooks is ahead of him, certainly. Jake Ferguson is ahead of him, surely. And I wouldn't be surprised to see Rico Dowdle catch more passes than Jalen Tolbert this year. I mean, what I say, Rico caught like 19 last year. I mean, he was only 3 behind Jalen Tolbert last year. So I'm not excited for Tolbert this year. I know I've been excited about Tolbert in the past, but even with the opportunity he had last year, he didn't do anything. I don't think it's going to change really this year. I also don't think that team is necessarily set up to really use that wide receiver 3 in a large capacity. Jalen Tolbert coming off your taxi squad, you make the tough decision. Go ahead and move on. Cut Jalen Tolbert.
Man, I am so proud of you. But we do have to, they're looking at some trades, hey.
It's true. You probably could trade him because he is the wide receiver 3 for the Cowboys.
And
they have the wide receiver, Bob, until the 6th round. And his name was Ryan Flournoy out of Southeast Mississippi State.
Yeah, we'll get to that. So I mean, there's some trades here for him the last couple of days, moving up in the 4th round, using Jalen Tolbert as a add-on, getting a 4th round pick for Jalen Tolbert, a 3rd round pick for Jalen Tolbert, which is just nuts to me. But again, that's the only one of that deal I see. So it's probably pretty rare. A trade up in the third, another Jalen Tolbert for a third. So, I mean, you never know. But I do think more than likely you're probably cutting him. And, just say, hey, tout these production grades that much more. Jalen Tolbert, production percentile, grade, 5th percent.
Not great.
And Ryan Flournoy, actually my lowest graded percentile score, 0th percent. So take that for what you will, and whatever it may or may not mean. But two guys who are also in the middle of the road when it comes to percentile grading and production profiles. I got two guys here. It's kind of a twofer we're doing here at the end. So Andrei Iosivas at 57% and Charlie Jones at 36% rostered. Both are taxi eligible still. So if you have the room, I'm fine kind of keeping these guys, but this is a numbers game. T. Higgins is still there, plus the addition of 2 possible receiving threats at tight end. So I think between the two of them, you get a receiving tight end threat out of these guys. Granted, they were day 3 picks. And then you have Jermaine Burton in day 2. And these guys help scare me off of these two players, Andrei Iosivas and Charlie Jones specifically, despite having Tyler Boyd currently leaving a hole in that offense. On top of that, Jermaine Burton is just a purely better prospect compared to Iosivas and Charlie Jones. Only 4 years in college, better production over the time against better competition, and a better athlete, I believe, as well. Tested pretty well at the combine. So, I mean, Jermaine Burton's just better, but Burton has had a way of not meeting our expectations for, coaches in college. Apparently, allegedly, that's been something that's been floated out there, but everybody's saying it, so it must be true. So maybe he doesn't meet our expectations now. Maybe we can hold these guys to see kind of what happens. But admittedly, these are two guys I had to cut in 2 different leagues. I had to cut both of them in one league, and I believe I cut Iosivas in the other league. But I've had to cut these guys because they just don't have room on my roster. I wasn't able to find a deal to trade these guys away for late picks. You might be able to snag a late pick for Iosivas if you're kind of ahead of the curve and getting the deal done, because part of the problem with trying to trade these guys and offload them to other rosters after the draft, everybody has more players kicking around than they did when they came to the draft. Unless they had no picks, then hey, maybe they're in good standing. But I know a lot of my league mates aren't. We were all not good operators when it came to that respect. So you're going to struggle, I think, moving on from these guys. As much as I like the players, especially Charlie Jones, I think we both love Charlie Jones.
Yeah, we love
Charlie.
Year.
Good old Chuckles, unfortunately, probably going to end up being a cut. He is below the roster percentile of players that are in common leagues where we have a standard setup of a 12-team league format, 25 roster spots, not including taxi. The 47th percentile is where that cutoff kind of kicks off, where this guy might be available in that league if you don't have taxi spots or he's a taxi consideration. But at this point, these guys are probably both cuts for me. As much as I'd love to hold on to them, if you have the room, like we said before, don't make cuts you don't have to. But Nate, you got one more. I got one more. One hurts a heck of a lot more than the other for me. What do you got for your last one?
My last one here, I got Nelson Agholor, who is currently rostered in just 10% of sleeper leagues, Bob. So most likely, a lot of you don't have to worry about cutting Nelson Agholor. He's probably sitting on your waiver wire. But if you play in a deeper league, Bob, I'm actually kind of interested in Nelson Agholor. That's why I wanted to throw him here at the end. Now, if you play in like the league you just mentioned, where it's 12 teams, 25 roster spots, that 47% rostered line there, there's no reason to pick up Nelson Agholor. But there's some of us that play in deeper leagues where it's 30 roster spots, 35 roster spots, even. I play in a couple leagues with 35 roster spots. It gets deep and it gets shallow at the same time. In those deeper leagues, I've actually want to consider Nelson Agholor as a pickup, even though the Ravens just drafted Devontae Walker in the 4th round. Walker's there to be that deep threat. But we both know, we watched Devontae Walker. He's raw. He's still got, some development before he's going to be a true downfield threat. The Ravens have Nelson Agholor, and they extended him a year this offseason. And with that extension, they are paying him, $6 million or so. And if they cut him, it'd be $5.5 million in dead cap. So he's going to be on that roster. And a championship contending team like the Ravens, Devontae Walker is not going to take that wide receiver 3 spot until he earns it. And as much as we've all loved to hate on Nelson Agholor before, he was a decent wide receiver 3 for the Ravens last year, and he will maintain that role this year for the majority of the year, I would think, until Devontae Walker is ready. I think that'll more likely be next year. They're going to move on from Nelson Agholor after this year, and Devontae Walker can step into that wide receiver 3 role, which as a Ravens fan, and we're talking fantasy, I mean, does that wide receiver 3 role even matter between the two of them? It's not the greatest wide receiver 3 for any team, but when you can pick up Agholor off waivers and you're in a deep league, I think he's on an offense that has a lot of potential, and Agholor has been around. He's a veteran that even though he has his ups and downs, he has been productive. So Nelson Agholor, available in 90% of leagues apparently. If you're in a deeper league, I would actually consider Nelson Agholor as a little pickup after the draft if you have the room.
Fair enough. I don't hate it, especially in those formats you mentioned. Deeper leagues, deeper slots. I think I actually have him in our Rewinders for Patron League. And speaking of which, talking Rewinder leagues, there will be some opening up in this next week or so. We'll be opening up some Goldie leagues, some additional Patreon leagues. So hey, if you want to join some leagues with us, head on over to patreon.com and we'll get you sorted in the Discord. But getting into this last one here, and this is going to hurt like a mother effer. But Michael Carter is no longer taxi squad eligible. He has been for a little bit now. 52% rostered in leagues still, but it's got to be done. And this is someone I actually had to cut from one of my leagues today. Tough. Alexa, play taps. After a high-end running back 3 finish in his rookie season, Carter has regressed significantly over the course of the last 2 seasons, finishing as running back 40 and running back 62. Watch out, ultimately doing nothing for you. And now in comes Trey Benson, who ultimately looks to be the successor to James Conner, as well as a high-end interim handcuff until that happens. And in all honesty, not that Carter was trending towards being anything more than fluff in that backfield anyway. Michael Carter carries no dead cap for the Cardinals if they elect to cut him. The Jets actually are carrying Michael Carter's dead cap, so they're paying him for not being on the roster. So free roster spot for the Cardinals to keep, I guess. So maybe he latches on there. Maybe they cut him and he latches on elsewhere. Either way, he's a free agent after the season. Maybe something happens for my boy. I hope he finds a home and somebody treats him well. But I'm not hopeful at this point. But
yeah,
if I can get any late pick for Mike Carter at this point, I'm in on it. Wasn't able to do it in the one league I cut him. Or utilizing him to slide up some picks if somebody's still a believer. That would be great. Somebody has to, I hope. But until then, he's clutter. And until the situation changes, he's clutter. And probably even after that, he is probably clutter to be and forever a roster clogger. In my heart, a heart clogger. To
Ooh,
say
you
the
get that
least.
checked.
Yeah, I should get that checked. But something else you should get checked if you are having problems cutting your players from your rosters after your rookie drafts. Check out the roster review option in the pinned comment below, as well as the YouTube description box. Check out the rookie draft guide if you haven't already. You can get one by copying the link below in the pinned comment or the YouTube description, or you can head over to patreon.com/Dynasty Rewind. Get in that gold tier, get in all the bonus Discord options and all the bonus tools that we have kicking around there, the ADP, the rankings. You get it, and you get a free copy of that rookie draft guide as well. So with that said, leave a like if you enjoyed the video, comment down below who you're trying to cut. We'll probably have a couple more of these because we had a long list and we only took a handful of them. So with all that said, we're going to get the heck on out of here. We will see you in the next one. But until then, I hope that y'all have a good one. Alexa, play taps. Oh, she started. Alexa, stop.
You got to put that in there. Just throw in the little Alexa, stop.
Yeah. Yeah, she actually started playing. I'm proud of her. She's usually, this one's a bad listener for whatever reason. Alexa, stop. Too funny. The one time I actually wanted her to not do something.